All right, everyone, welcome back. We are going to be talking about topic 8.3 today, the effects of the Cold War. And so the topic that we're covering today is kind of a continuation of 8.2, where we've kind of set the stage of what the Cold War was. We'll talk about the effects around the world because of the Cold War to some extent here. So, the essential question is, in what ways did both the USSR and the United States seek to maintain spheres of influence during the Cold War? Remember, we talked about the idea, that concept of spheres of influence in the last topic, where you have basically more influence of your ideology over a country than another. So the USSR supporting the ideas of communism and to some degree authoritarianism, and then the United States, trying to promote democratic values and certainly capitalist and free market values at the same time. So let's go ahead and move on. The idea of context is building up that again. After World War II, you have the United States and the USSR have completely different ideologies. We talked about this before. And one term that may come up that you should be aware of is the idea of the Iron Curtain. This is something that was coined in a speech by Winston Churchill when he visited the United States. And he talks about how an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. You have, a division in Europe between the Eastern Bloc states and Western Europe, where the Eastern Bloc states are satellite nations of the USSR, communist puppet governments that were created for the purpose of trying to create a buffer zone for the Soviet Union to protect them from the West. Since they had been invaded by France, by Germany, they wanted some sort of buffer zone to protect them, to avoid any type of invasion again. Remember that the Soviets lost roughly 20 million people in World War II, and so it's something that they definitely did want to and were concerned by, and that's my coworker joining us today. She's very needy. Anyway, this is including of Germany, which after World War II was split into two parts. And this was done originally for the purpose of liberation and reconstruction, where the Western Germany was split between France, Britain, and the United States. And then the same holds true for Berlin. It was broke up into four sectors themselves, one controlled by the United States, one controlled by Britain, and one controlled by France. And then, of course, one controlled by the USSR, who also took control of East Germany. And Berlin, as we'll talk about a little bit, it lies kind of smack dab in the middle of the East German state. And so that's going to complicate things. And we'll talk about that more as we kind of get into it. This kind of the language of the curriculum is: the Cold War produced new military alliances, including NATO and Warsaw Pact, and led to nuclear proliferation, also a fancy word, with the buildup of nuclear weapons, and proxy wars between and within post-colonial states in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So some of the major effects of the war itself. The co-worker's still there, I guess. All right, so let's talk about Berlin. And Berlin is a country or a city that's almost like a city-state when it originally started and such, but it's very obvious why it's the capital of Germany. It's a very big city. It sits on the rivers. It's geographically located pretty, easily. So you see right here, Berlin is kind of, imagine Germany prior to World War One, with East Prussia over here and such. It was generally pretty centrally located within the German state and the German Empire, homelands and so forth. So that's kind of why it's chosen. Anyway, at the start of the Cold War, the Stalin had basically decided that he was going to blockade, and this is kind of very shortly after World War II has ended, after the Potsdam Conference. The relationship between the former Allies deteriorates extremely quickly, and then when that happens, he decides he's going to blockade Berlin. Essentially, the areas within West Berlin would not be able to get vital supplies sent to them over land, how they had been doing for some time. So basically, they put it's an idea of putting Berlin under siege, West Berlin under siege. in the hopes that they would surrender and he would be able to take control of all of Berlin itself, rather than having this small little area that he didn't have control within East Germany. So the blockade was a bit of a risk on his part, and it does not pay off. The reason for this is that the former Allies, organize what's basically known as the Berlin Airlift. And this is an incredible story. And when we're talking about logistics that came along with it, it's pretty impressive. So because they couldn't supply things over land, the only way they could do it was through the air. Well, West Berlin has an airport right in the middle of the city. It's no longer active, but it's a pretty impressive sized airport in the middle of Berlin, which works to their advantage in this case. So the Allies are going to fly in supplies round the clock. I think that it was like every 30, 40 seconds, they would have a new plane landing, offsetting the stuff, and then they would take off and go back and get more supplies. The incredible amount of choreography needed to make this supply train work was impressive. Remember, planes do not carry as much stuff as like supply trucks, convoys, trains, things like that. And so they just needed to fly all these sorties and they flew everything they could into Berlin to help with the rebuilding of Berlin, to help maintain a comfortable, secure lifestyle for those who are the West Berliners as well. And so this whole thing lasted for 11 months, from June 48 to May 49. And this round the clock supply train coming in by air was basically the first victory in the Cold War, if we want to call it a victory, where Stalin basically is forced to lift the blockade. It's an embarrassment to him. He tried to force the West Berliners to surrender to the East Berlin and East Germany and become part of that. But because of the consistent supplies that were coming in, it was not worth the risk anymore. There's a great story that goes along with the Berlin Airlift, and me, I like to talk about like little stories every now and again. But there's this man who comes from Utah, somewhere in the south, like Hurricane and St. George area, and that is kind of why I like to talk about the story. But he kind of becomes known as the Candy Bomber, and the reason he's got this moniker, this name, is that when he was part of the Berlin Airlift and such, and he would drop the supplies off and then they would take off again, there would always be these kids and people that would be at the end of the runway where the planes just kind of fly right over them, which is probably an incredibly exhilarating feeling and such. And so he noticed that they'd collect there and such. And so he started bringing bags of candy with him. And as he flies, takes off and such, he would open this window and then throw out candy, and it would drop onto the kids, and he'd become known as the Candy Bomber. So dropping Hershey chocolates, hard candies, whatever. That was just like, an incredible example of the humanity that this whole thing was around, is giving these kids like something of a luxury. And in doing so in a very non-selfish way. So if you ever got more time to look it up, the Candy Bomber, it's an incredible story, and I think that it's worth talking about some more. So anyway, going back off my tangent back towards important matters to the curriculum, Germany, was split into these two states, as we mentioned. Let's go back. And so because the East Berliners were stuck under the control of a communist satellite government, puppet government of the Soviets, rebuilding after the war was not a priority as much as it was in the West. And remember that both sides are fighting for spheres of influence. So how can the West show that they are a superior ideology to the East? You try to rebuild and make, life back to normalcy for the Berliners and such. And so the East Berlin was, the rebuild was very slow, and you still had all these bomb out buildings and going into the 50s and the 60s. And West Berlin has been rebuilt. Life looks much more luxurious in the West and everything. And so many East Berliners, East Germans start to escape East Berlin in Germany through West Berlin, and so this was incredibly embarrassing to the Soviets because here they are, they're talking about having this superior ideology, the superior lifestyle, and all of these people, roughly 2.5 million people, are fleeing to go to the West. So, to try to stop that, they are going to create what becomes known as the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall was not to keep West Berliners out of East Berlin, because, it's surrounded. It was to keep East Berliners and Germans out of the West. And so this wall basically goes around the entirety of West Berlin. It's going to be guarded. It has, it's fairly tall. And so, this is something that goes up. And, we talk about the Iron Curtain descending on Europe. This was the physical manifestation of an Iron Curtain, the division between East and West. And both sides, would have kind of soldiers along the side. We talked about spy games and such. There was a lot of missions apparently to get people who wanted to have refugee status, asylum seekers, to sneak them across the border in the West. And so there's a lot of things that go along there. Of course, 1989, the Berlin Wall will come down in a pretty amazing celebration. I was very young at the time, but I remember watching on TV and the news as people were celebrating on top of the wall and like taking jackhammers and sledgehammers to it and so forth. It was pretty impressive. But that wall becomes a symbol of the division in the world created by the Cold War. All right. So let's move on to new alliances. We talked about this briefly in our previous topic. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is going to establish the NATO alliance that we talked about last time, made up mostly of Western European countries and North American countries like the United States and Canada. And the idea was to coordinate a defense against any potential aggression by the Soviets or the Eastern Bloc states. Of course, Article 5 is saying that if they attack one country, then all the countries will come to their defense. So even a small little country, I don't know, Norway, strategically, it's got iron, and a lot of happy people, but it doesn't. If it was to lose control of it to the Soviets, it would not hurt the West terribly bad. But because of the alliance itself, they want Norway and protected. They want as many countries to stay into the sphere of influence of the same ideological ideas of the United States and Western Europe. And so if they attack them, they attack all of them. So that's why they have that treaty in place. The Warsaw Pact was created in response, and we talked about this last time, because the Soviets saw that the United States was trying to create an alliance, and they saw that as a threat to their sovereignty, to the balance of power, shifting and maybe to another direction. So to counter that, they create their own alliance system with Eastern Bloc states and those satellite nations and so forth. And of course, they supply them with military weapons and so forth. And so that's something that occurs during this time period, is the Warsaw Pact. So even though these two alliances were standing off against each other, the war in Europe never breaks out again. The idea of deterrence. And if you attack one of ours, we all attack you. And the same goes with the Warsaw Pact. So it was just better not to attack them. And that's important to note. Some other organizations and alliances that were created during the Cold War and the light of the Cold War: SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, that was created in 1954 following the Korean War, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It involved the United States, Australia, France, UK, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, and Thailand. And essentially, this was to stop the spread of communism in a way that is similar to NATO. If you attack one of them, you attack all of them. So, and then CENTO, which was a central treaty organization basically was formed at protecting the Middle East. This was led by the United Kingdom, and they want to protect former mandate provinces of theirs. Iraq, Iran, Pakistan was one of them, and Turkey, to stop communism to spread into the Middle East. Of course, the big strategic purposes for that is, what does the Middle East have lots of? And it's oil, right? So that's something that was created. Another example of an alliance that was created. Another effect of the Cold War is these new alliances. And you think we'd learn our lesson from World War One, that alliances are not always the best, but in this case, it didn't turn out to be too terrible yet, because NATO still exists today. So because the Cold War never ends up being a shooting war between the two superpowers themselves. What are you doing, Bill? It's my coworker again. And so the ideological war that exists is going to be over those spheres of influences in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And as a result, you'll see some proxy wars being fought. So even though the Soviets and the United States never directly fight each other, they do have proxies where they have sides within these countries that they're supporting. And as a result, that ideological hotspots, the hot wars themselves, happen between peoples that are backed by one of the two superpowers or both superpowers. So we're going to talk about some examples of those proxy wars that occurred in history. And we're going to start with Korea, which is the first major proxy war itself. Okay. And so Korea was, a kingdom that was had sovereignty over its own land for thousands of years, despite the fact that they were right next door to the giants that are China. And were able to keep their lands sovereign, and they were a tribute state of China for some time. But the Chinese looked at the geography there and says, no way we can really conquer that land. But when industrialization occurs in Japan, and the need for more supplies, Japan reaches out to islands in the Pacific, and of course they also imperialize Korea starting about 1910. After World War II, though, Japan is going to be kicked out of Korea. And what ends up happening is that in the agreements made in the conferences between the big three, they basically split Korea along the 38th parallel. And then everything north of the 38th parallel would be under the guidance and protectorate of the Soviets. And then the south would be the United States, and the other allies, mostly the United States. And of course, just like what happens in Europe, the Soviets are going to back a communist governor, a guy named Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un today. But he's going to be the first of that ruling communist dynasty that's still there today. And in the South, they support a democratic, government, one that's based around free markets and everything like that, which South Korea very much is today. And so the United States is going to support this idea, and what ends up happening is that you have Korea split into two. However, both sides, the North and the South, wanted a reunited Korea at some point, and but both sides wanted the reunited Korea under their new ideology, either communism or democratic capitalism. So in 1950, the North, with the permission of Stalin, Kim Il-sung decides to invade the South. And you can see on this little timeline GIF here, the invasion goes pretty good for it. And so here we go. They catch the South off guard. It's so quick and fast. They push them all the way down to the Pusan barrier. This is almost became another Dunkirk, where you would have to evacuate all of these soldiers. But the United Nations voted to conduct what they called a police action. And 16 countries, mainly spearheaded by the United States, send soldiers. And the United States had a large number of soldiers. They were occupying Japan after World War II. General Douglas MacArthur, who was pretty much a hero during World War II, one of the main generals. He sent to try to rectify it, and so they land a bunch of Marines at Incheon. And this, caught the North Koreans off guard. And, the fear was that they're all pushing towards Busan. And here comes the Marines and the U.S. Army coming behind them. Well, they decide to escape back across the 38th parallel before. And then the United Nations forces, the U.S. And South Koreans, are going to push them all the way up towards the Yalu River. And the Yalu River is the barrier, the geographical barrier and boundary between China and the North Korea. So as the UN forces are pushing up further and further towards the north, the Chinese are getting very nervous. They do not like this because, hey, they're a communist country. They may not always see eye to eye on everything, but they are considered allies even today. And so they saw this as a threat to their sovereignty. And so China declares war and they get involved. And so they push the American and UN forces back down here. And it ends up becoming a stalemate. And you'll see, because it's moving along here, that it becomes a stalemate along the 38th parallel. And so here's kind of where it ends. Let's see, wait till 1952 or so. Yeah, this is about where it ends. And it becomes not trench warfare, but very similar to where neither side's gaining ground. A lot of people are dying and so forth. And so eventually an armistice is signed. And when I say armistice, it's basically a ceasefire. No treaty has ever ended this war, and it's still considered going on today. And something that happens quite often, and happens within the last several years, is that we call it saber rattling. Both sides are basically show off their military strength in some way. And something that Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, has been doing is testing missiles and building nuclear weapons and so forth, so that it gives him more kind of leverage in negotiations for things that he wants, in particular to stay in power. But yeah, that's what goes on in North and South Korea today. The war itself, it's not hot right now, but there are things that happen from time to time that worry that the rest of the world that a war could potentially break out. And if North Korea does have nuclear weapons and the ability to use nuclear weapons, that could be a very scary thing. So anyway, this proxy war is kind of the first major one. No side really wins in it, but it is something that does occur in history. So, all right, so let's move on to the Vietnam War. And this is another example of a proxy war that occurs. Vietnam was a French colony for a very long time. And in 1954, the communist guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh are going to successfully surround the French occupying forces in a place called Dien Bien Phu, right over here. And this is a valley. They basically get stuck in the valley and their forces surrender. And this was kind of the moment where France basically says, we're out. We're not going to try to continue occupying the Southeast Asia and France, or the Vietnamese country anymore. So at the Geneva Peace Treaty, Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and of course, going back to the ideas that the United States does not want to see the spread of communism anymore, as well as other Western powers, they decided to split Vietnam into two. The North would be, under the communist government of Ho Chi Minh. The South would be under, I want to say capitalist, I want to say democratic at all. But they back a guy named Nguyen Dien Diem. Diem is not a good leader. He's a Catholic. Much of the country is Buddhist. He bans Buddhist practices. This leads to protest where you see monks, send themselves on fire, against these policies. It was not a good situation. He was not a good leader, but he wasn't communist. So that was a plus, but eventually the United States decides to support a coup d'etat to remove him from power. Um, Now, that problems that exist in South Vietnam kind of set the stage for Ho Chi Minh trying to exploit the idea of trying to reunite Vietnam. He has much better success in the north of redistributing land and doing a lot of new policies that are to the benefit of many peasants in Vietnam, and so a lot of people in South were supportive of reuniting with the North under a direction of Ho Chi Minh. But the United States, this major superpower, did not want to see that happen. And so, as the Northern Vietnamese army is coming downward to try to to reunite, there's also these um, communist guerrillas that are trying to destabilize the South Vietnamese government. They're known as the Viet Cong. They are trying to reunite this country, and the United States is not having at it. So we start to send in advisors to help the South Vietnamese fight against the North. Those advisors start getting killed, so we have to send in soldiers to protect the advisors. They start getting killed, and this slow and gradual buildup up to 1965, where it really explodes. Um, you know, over the course of multiple presidencies, the Vietnam War becomes, up until Afghanistan, America's longest involved war. So from 1954 to 1975, this war occurs. The United States is going to pull out about 1973 and signed a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. The idea, the reason why we're doing this is the idea, of containment, number one. Number two, there was this idea of the domino theory that was prevalent in the decision-making process or the policies of the United States government at that time. The idea was that if Vietnam falls to communism, Cambodia will fall to communism, Laos will fall to communism, Thailand, and so forth, and all of South Asia will fall to communism. And we didn't want to see that happen because, hey, there's economic potentials here, and we do not want them to go onto the side of the Reds. So that's why we stuck young men in this theater of war, in a war that didn't have a front line. It was pretty much, wherever the enemy is, go out and seek them, find them, kill them, drop a bunch of bombs. We dropped more bombs on Vietnam than we did in the all of World War II, and it's just, this war ended up, being something that was an unwinnable war itself. So over time, the United States kind of realizes, they sign a peace treaty in 1973 where they, pull out of the war itself. And then 1975, South Vietnam is invaded by the North. And Saigon falls. That was the capital of South Vietnam. Saigon falls to the North. And it is a united country today. It is still a communist government, but they do allow certain capitalist and free market ventures as well. Okay. Oops. Skip one. Cuba. That's Caribbean island, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. That is another example of a proxy war. Cuba in 1898 became a protectorate of the United States. It once was a Spanish colony. In the Spanish-American War, the United States fought, and you guys will learn a lot more about this in AP US history. But part of the reason for that war was that many people saw how the Cubans were treated by the Spanish, and they wanted to help liberate them. And so while the United States took possession of the Philippines and the Puerto Rico and Guam in that war, they did make Cuba an independent country. And I'm going to say independent with quotations. Basically, they made them a protectorate. We were allowed to take land in Cuba, to make into a naval base known as Guantanamo Bay. You may have heard of that. And then at the same time, we were basically putting in place a government and supporting a government that stuck with our interest and to get more supplies from Cuba, in particular sugar. So, but in 1959, and this government was not a good government that we put in place. A lot of people of lower classes did not feel well represented in this government. So a revolution occurs, led by leaders such as Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro ends up overthrowing the American-backed Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista. And once he's out, he flees to the United States, and Fidel Castro becomes the communist dictator of Cuba. So this was a problem because when we talked about containment, and you want to contain communism, and here we have a country that is 90 miles away from the coast of the United States that is now a communist. And so, this happened kind of in the transition from the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy. When Kennedy comes into the presidency, he directs the CIA and to kind of come up with some sort of coup d'etat that could eventually topple the government of Fidel Castro and put in place a better, more friendly, non-communist government in its place. And so the CIA came up with a plan to create an invasion of people who had fled Cuba and fled the rule of Fidel Castro, and we trained them. And then we supported them to invade Cuba. And in doing so, they thought that would kind of lead to an uprising by the people who would want to overthrow Fidel Castro. It did not happen that way. And so, don't know how, but they, knew that they were coming in some aspect and were ready, and they had defenses put up. They got pinned down on the beach when they tried to invade. The invasion went very poorly from the very beginning, and the United States and John F. Kennedy decides, all right, back down, we're pulling out. We did not give them the air support that they needed, so they either died on the beach or captured and surrendered. Surrendered and captured, I should say. And this was incredibly embarrassing to John F. Kennedy, and it basically plagues his whole administration and his ability to be an effective president. A lot of people think of John Kennedy as being this, one of the best presidents of all time. At that day and age, I don't think people saw that way. He was a great speaker, inspired a lot of good things, the space race and so forth, but generally an ineffective president for the most part. It's his successor who gets the more stuff done, especially domestic policy wise. So the United States, have lost Cuba basically at that point. But another incident at Cuba in October of 1962, the United States flies, missions over Cuba with these planes that go fly up way high in the air. They're called U-2s. And they are going to discover the USSR is putting intercontinental ballistic missiles, or CPMs, into Cuba, and these missiles would only give the United States 5 minutes warning. It's my coworker again. 5-minute warning in Washington to be able to respond. And so this is a grave threat to the United States, something that cannot be allowed by the American government and John F. Kennedy being the president at the time. So this leads to a very tense standoff. Once we announce to the world we know they're there and that they need to be removed, John F. Kennedy orders what's known as a quarantine. The quarantine itself was just a fancy word for a blockade. They didn't say blockade because a blockade basically means that there is a war. That's an act of war, I should say. And so this whole tense set off, ends up going for the next 13 days. And the United States had plans to invade Cuba, bomb those sites, and take over Cuba again to prevent any future weapons from going in there. But it's very risky because you don't know if you're going to get all of them in any bombing raids. You're going to kill Russians. If we kill Russians, then they'll invade East Berlin or West Berlin. And then if they invade Berlin and West Germany, then we would have to respond using our weapons of mass destruction to try to stop once they're nuclear, and then they fire theirs and everyone dies. Yikes, right? So this is as close as we're going to get to World War III. But the 11th hour, a deal is made through back channels between Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier, and Kennedy's administration. So basically, the Soviets agree that they're going to remove the missiles. They're not going to put any more in there. And then 6 months later, we would agree that we would remove our missiles, which we had stationed in Turkey, that were relatively close to them. So this, in the end, both sides don't win and both sides don't lose. but it came very, very, very close. So Cuba, another example of a proxy war that occurs during the Cold War. So the last one here, second to last one, sorry, is Angola. This is in Africa. It used to be a Portuguese colony. And so they are going to win their independence. We'll talk more about that and another topic after 14 years of armed conflict. The more important thing is relating to how this becomes a proxy war is that Angola itself was a very ethnically diverse country. And so, once the Portuguese are out, there is going to be a civil war that occurs in Angola between these three major ethnic groups that are going to be backed by two of the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So the USSR and Cuba, they're going to back the Mbundu, who are going to share similar ideologies to the Soviets. South Africa backs up the Omvibundu, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that 100% correct, as you probably can guess. And the Congo were backed by the United States themselves. And so these are countries, these are ethnic tribes that were backed by that shared similar ideologies and so forth. And the Civil War is going to, take place from 1975 to 2002. So over the course of the majority of the later half of the Cold War, even past the Cold War itself, which ends around 1990, 1991. And even in Angola today, there's still a lot of ethnic violence that occurs between these three ethnic groups. So, but this is another example of that proxy war and such, where they're they're backing somebody from one side to fight on behalf of the ideology that they share in hopes of gaining more spheres of influence. So the last one is the Sandistas-Contra War. And so this is something that occurs in Latin America. So in 1979, Nicaragua was under the control for a very long time by a dictatorship of the Somoza family. And this was ended by socialist rebels known as the Sandistas and such. And they're socialists, so there's close to communists as you're going to get. And so, again, containment. And the United States doesn't want to see this happen. They don't want to see, a Latin American country, which goes against the ideas of the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States basically declares itself as the hegemony of the West, and that the Eastern countries, European countries, ought not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere in any way. So the United States is going to back a group of anti-socialists. They're known as the Contras. The Contras themselves, some of them were brought to the United States to train. We give them lots of weapons. This is all done in very secret, hush-hush manner. When you get into AP US history, you'll learn about how the Reagan administration became under fire for secretly supplying these Contras and so forth. And so there was a big scandal that kind of plagues, Ronald Reagan's administration. So the United States is going to back these Contras, and it's just another example of a proxy war where we have the Sandistas, who are backed by the Soviets, the Contras are backed by the United States, and they're both fighting for control in a guerrilla war. I have the worst coworker. Anyway, in 1989, the Telo Accords basically assigned that both agreed to disarm, but there's still violence that occurs in Nicaragua today. This is why one of the reasons why you have so many Central American refugees trying to come to the United States, because of the longstanding violence that occurs in that country. All right. So this was a long one, and I talked a lot about some things that probably did not need to be known, but I love history, and I'm not apologizing for that. So The essential question that you do need to answer for today is in what ways did both the USSR and the United States send, I don't know why I said seed, or seek to maintain spheres of influence? Let me go back to the beginning. That one's correct. I know that. Okay. So, yes, again, in what ways both the USSR and the US seek to maintain spheres of influence during the Cold War? So, think about the question, write a response to in Canvas. We'll have another topic lecture up later today. So, keep an eye out for that. All right. All right. Let's go. You want to say hi, Bill, as we're trying to stop this? No? Okay.